got a really great show for you today. It's all about the origins of language. So amazing, you know, because a primitive language exists. Certainly our energy in motion, our emotion, is a primitive form of language within ourselves. We could take an amoeba from a lake or some terrestrial animal, that amoeba, and we could put something in front of it which it enjoys, and it moves toward this, and it moves away from things. If you prick it with a pin or something like that, it moves away from stimulus which is not pleasant. So our energy and motion within ourselves is a primitive form of language. Of course, you know, we've got pheromones, which we have a vomeronasal organ, which we have two little slits on the inside of the portion of the nose that separates the two chambers, and then nerves go back to a place called the vomeronasal area, where pheromones are sensed and give us a sense of things. Of course, the trees and plants and animals still to this very day communicate to each other more through pheromones, which is other than olfactory. That's another way, of course, that plants and animals communicate to each other. Could we say that the peacock's feathers and all of the flowers in nature are all symbols causing and attracting and repelling of various forces that's either friendly or unfriendly? We have chemical changes that take place where amoebas and cell-like creatures that we consider to be an organism can sense things on a chemical level. This is called alliesthetic chemical change. An alliesthetic sense works for us when you're eating something in its whole food state. When you've had enough of that, the chemistry of your body senses you've had enough of that. This is sort of a form of language. So the other kind of primitive form of language that exists really is what's called primary perception. And because all of our body is made out of cells which are like oscillating circuits, species communicate to each other through a primary perception, through resonance. So when one egg is broken, if it was, all the other eggs register this. When you would have poured antiseptic down the sink and that killed the bacteria, all of the plants register the die-off of those bacteria. This is a connection that we have through primary perception. For the most part, you could say that the animals are more stimulus signal bound. They can signal and things like that to each other, and from these signals they can pick up all sorts of things, from hoots and howls of uh-oh, that's a snake present, or hey, there's danger, or hey, I'm lost, I need to know where mum is, and this sort of a thing. When we come back, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how language formed in us. We're going to be talking a little bit about our aquatic existence and the concept of I and how these formed. We've got a really great show for you. It's all about the origins of language. This is Dr. David Jubb. This is the universe inside our mind. Stay tuned for some more exciting information coming up. Oh, we're back. It's so amazing, you know. We've got Ray behind the lens of the camera again, bringing us this show. Thank you, Ray. We're shooting this in the East Village at Jubb's Longevity. We shoot a lot of shows here. Maybe you'd love to come and be part of an audience as we film this show. It's so amazing, you know, because we talk about politics and behaviour. We talk about all sorts of things, various conditions of health and achieving vitality and longevity. We talk about economics, environmental sorts of issues, and certainly we talk about language and this sort of thing, body language. Really great show where we go into depth in a whole range of areas. But anyway, it's so amazing, you know. We can only go into things in so much because our show's 28 minutes. And I really want to do what I can to whet your appetite so it's possible for you to have an insight and be part of this critical mass. Could we say that these shows, as you watch them, and each topic really is part of you having delivered to you these special forces, because each of us we are somewhere, and to me I feel in watching this show you're part of the vigilante of this family, really going to bat where you can. We really have a deep insight into various issues, and it's possible for us to change the world the most with this information. But anyway, it's so amazing, we can only go into things in so much depth. But did you know we have an aquatic existence? When we had an aquatic existence, eyesight became less important. Olfaction, the smell of things, became less important in water. Something became very much more important was sound. Because you could have your head in the water and you could make a sound, and that water conducts sound quite incredibly. You could raise your head up out of the water and not necessarily being able to have to see where someone is in the pod around you. You could tell instantly by them making some sound. In our semi-aquatic existence we had between 12 million years ago and 3.7 million years ago, when the Earth was covered by vast seas, we had a semi-aquatic existence which explains many things, including the formation of language. Certainly when we started to eat crustaceans as part of our diet, our palate started to soften much more, and enabled us to have a softer palate to be able to articulate sound a lot more. We bobbed more in an upright condition, and we became free of our head being an appendage. So we had a lot more sensory motor complex available to us in this freely suspended state to contemplate much more so, and to have a greater amount of nerve cells available for an awareness more of our environment. We start to make sound much more importantly than we ever had. Sound was important before, but now it becomes much more important. We live in a semi-aquatic existence, and so we start to communicate more to each other through sound, even as the dolphins and other mammals that have shifted back into the sea, that had their pelvic girdle straightened as we do in this swimming sort of environment. We lived in a more of a semi-aquatic existence, but anyway, that's another show. Let's get back to how language formed, just for you to know that our semi-aquatic existence caused us to have a soft palate, caused a subcutaneous layer of fat laying underneath our skin, caused our senses to be changed in the way that we apply them in our sensory motor complex. The softer palate caused articulation of sound much more so. Our bobbing upright in this floating environment caused the head no longer to be an appendage, and there to be much less proprioceptive activity, electrical activity, which 90% of the electrical activity we have in the brain is mostly coming from our limb placement, in relationship to each other limb. And so that quietened down enormously as a result of our floating, and we had the greater ability to be able to be more sensorily aware. And so this time passed and things slowly developed a lot more, and higher tones, of course, if we can imagine that, higher tones are more easily heard than lower tones. Women have a higher voice, and could we say that their superior brain for language enabled them to be the primary mode in introducing language more as we know it today. It's called a mother tongue, it's not called a father tongue. In law, from ancient times, people donned wigs and robes, let their hair long, and they presented themselves and the law as through these images. It's called a mother tongue, and this is the throwback to a time where she was the primary person that was responsible for the law. Certainly 50,000 years ago we have much more of a matriarchal sort of a society, and long before that, most of you study the primates, they're mostly all matriarchal societies, where the males are kicked to be farther out in the field language doesn't form for them. They become a lot more stimulus signal bound still, and still to this very day they're much more visual spatial sorters than women. But anyway, a higher tone, you know, when you come into a fold as a man and there's a baby present, you always go, "Hi," and you raise your voice. A throwback to a time where, to have rapport, when you entered into a circle, you did what you could to sort of raise your voice a little. Certainly higher voice and higher tones are much more penetrating, and her voice can go right through the walls of a house, whereas his voice is sort of very muffled and it's just sort of falls between the space of the bricks and is deadened by the bricks, and that's it. But a higher voice is very piercing, and in the forest where we might not have been able to see each other, her voice could carry a long, long way. Of course, in music, when you're in an orchestra listening to one, and it's jazz music, if there's a part for the bass, which sometimes there is, the piano has to quieten down incredibly for us to hear the melody of the bass. The moment that the piano gets going again, bam, the bass melody is lost. That's the very same with our voices. As women sing, their voices carry the melody, and their voices take over the melody. This is because a higher tone is more carrying than a lower tone. So, of course, all of our words come from actions originally, and still to this very day, our words have a connection, if we go back 50,000 years, phonetically through sound. All of the languages are connected together in one language through sound. Sound is a much more older way of our communicating to each other. Long before written language came, the primary way that information was passed down to each other was more through story, and much of what I have to say to you is not really written anywhere, but it was passed down to me through teachers in an oral tradition. And so much of this you're hearing even today is not really written anywhere, through scraps and bits that I've written down, but most of it is still being passed down through an oral tradition, which it's very difficult to turn your hearing off if someone's speaking, isn't it? It's very difficult to turn your feelings off if not to feel things that's going on, but it's very easy to decide not to look at something if you don't want to. It's so amazing, you know, because when the very first things started to be written down, it wasn't long after that, when things were being counted, that the very first things were written down, and laws of the land became written down on a post. And once laws were written down on a post, the visual system and the concept of I started to form. Long before this, we had more of what's called a bicameral mind, a more mind where our reptilian complex and our emotional limbic system of the brain really has its sort of language. Of course, lizards communicate to each other, which is the reptilian brain, more through movement. And so, you know, she sort of wiggles her hips around and he puffs his chest up. And lizards, through this very primitive reptilian complex, can communicate to each other enormous amounts of information just through movement. When sound really has come to be much more so, things guttural sorts of sounds and things, all these sounds came from languages. Something pleasing was something with a something fearful was a f, like f, which was the flicking sound. Sounds make us feel a little bit like something's up, you know. Is sort of more explosive sorts of sounds, b can be more for bad, but other sounds as well, and g for good and God and things like this. So our sounds are very, very ancient. The sounds that we make and the meaning we put behind those sounds, could we say for the most part, her brain was very much more involved. Of course, wife is equal to life, and house bound means being put into bondage for reproduction. Menial tasks mean men. Menial tasks means hard work out there. To be man-aged means man means to be put to work. To be penal, which means penis-ized, means to be having given a penis. For things like mal, which means male, it means not formed properly. So these are all words which have crept into our language, which no one really has ever questioned at all, but is a throwback to a sexually rigged sort of paradigm where language evolved, and still to this very day is controlling us without people having any awareness much of the meaning of these sounds. There's a subtle form of sexism. There's a subtle form of sexism even in language and words. God being equal to dark is much more so for most of the cultures of the earth up till some 50,000 years ago, and then God being equivalent to light. These are all sort of racist sorts of ways of thinking about things. But language is very sexist, and it's also racist. So these are things we can all become much more sensitive to as we search for a livingness, and we live a life more of egalitarianism, where the animals, the birds, the insects, every living creature is equivalent, and we do everything we can to live more in a world of this. But anyway, her brain had a lot more to do with the formation of language, and laws were written on a post, and all of a sudden I could decide not to look at that if I didn't want to. And a self-autonomy starts to form in consciousness where there wasn't really this self-autonomy before this. Of course, a dog can fart and defecate close to you, and it really is not so conscious of having done that. At the beach it can flick sand in your face and jumping around, and it's really not aware that it's done that. All animals are much more stimulus signal bound than humans, and the moment that the concept of I started to form, when things were written on a post and our visual system started to be used more as language, self-autonomy started to form. I could decide not to look at that if I didn't want to, whereas it was much more difficult for me to turn my hearing off when things were being spoken through story. It was much more difficult to turn my feelings off, but it was very easy to decide not to look at something if you didn't want to. So the moment this occurred, the concept of I started to form, which is more about a self-consciousness. In human beings, you could say, is much more self-conscious than just about any other animal. They're the only ones that can worry themselves to death. They're the only ones who could really bump into each other on the street corner, even though no one else is present. Human beings are so internal, matter of fact, that they've really lost their way. And in the ancient text it says that, whilst the fox has a den and the sparrows have a beautiful nest in the heavens, human beings have nowhere to lay their head. They've become so into the supernatural, have lost their way with what's natural. They're completely living in the unnatural and the supernatural, and we need to move back toward the natural. As this concept of I formed, of course, language started to form. Of course, many races are still much more closer to the earth, and they process things more through the kinesthetic, auditory, visual, and these are geniuses. The geniuses amongst us all process the information more through feeling first, having a preference for this, and then hearing, and then seeing. Give me 5 is kinesthetic. Jive is auditory. To see what I mean is visual. Some people are much more kinesthetic, auditory, visual orientated, and there's a lot more genius and discovery that can come about from this, and more feeling orientation of people than people who are living in their head. Accountants and attorneys primarily are the most notorious people for living in their heads, valuing what they see, valuing what they hear, and having hardly any value at all for the kinesthetic self. It makes for very poor strategy for getting to know how others are feeling in communicating. These people often have a form of dyslexia on this level. People who are kinesthetic, auditory, visual, they can have some sort of a dyslexia visually because it can be below consciousness much more. And because English is such a visual language, you have to see the letter P and the letter H in the word phonetic to know how it's spelt. Whereas lots of other languages are much more auditory orientated, Spanish and Russian and just about the vast majority of older language, much more kinesthetic, auditory orientated, and the sound is how it's spelt. But English, totally opposite. You have to see the letter P and the letter H in the word phonetic to know how it's spelt, and good spellers visually imprint the word in their mind and spell from the visual imprint. Ask an attorney how to spell something, and she or he will generally write it on a piece of paper and it looks right to them, and they say that's it. But if they spell it by sound, they could be either coming from a visual representation in their mind from having seen it, or they have to write it down to see it, and then they can tell you that's the way you spell this word. English is a very visual language. All the testing procedures in this country are extremely culturally bound and do not serve the ethnocentricity that exists in the world, in this modern world, and can be changed drastically. And who knows, one day I'm going to write a treatise all about education, and that will have an education system based on whole brain functioning and eye awareness and this work, or we might call it Jubbism, I don't know. But anyway, that's another story. It's so amazing because when we come back we're going to be talking a little bit about the vestibular sense, which is the very first sense to form on the earth, formed in the ectoderm stage in embryology when our nerves and our cells of our body were complete. This is called the ectoderm stage in embryology. The vestibular sense, the very first sense to form on earth. When we come back we're going to talk a little bit more about the vestibular sense in moving into this modern world and being able to have whole brain functioning through right language. This is Dr. David Jubb. This is the universe inside our mind. Stay tuned for some more exciting information coming up. So amazing, you know, because if you look back some of the oldest texts, especially the Older Testament, King David 4,000 years ago said that there would be this new covenant that will come to be over the earth, and this new covenant involves language. It's so amazing, you know, because the more that it's possible for you to develop an awareness of the vestibular sense, which is forward, back, up, down, whole body movements, turning, all these words predicate the vestibular sense. Just like to see what I mean involves the vision, the colour, the perspective, the frame of reference are visual words. To go, get, to have, to do, and to move are all kinesthetic words. The sound of the words, to discuss, to mention, to admit, to explain, that clicks, that rings the bell, all of these expressions are auditory. How we use our brain, we either use it in a kinesthetic, auditory, or visual sort of a way. We could be using it in a vestibular. The vestibular sense is the sense of whole body movement, forward, back, up, down, in, out, as prepositions relate to the vestibular system. So we could be using our brain more in a whole brain functioning way, where we're framing things positively. You're moving toward, which is being associated in life, and you focus on things within, which is being associated, versus dissociation. Focus on what I'm moving away from, what I want to get rid of, and what's outside of me, blah blah blah. And so this is all being dissociated in life. Being associated in life is focusing on using words where you're moving toward things and you're focused on things within, and this is more being associated. You've got multiple versus singular processing ability you have to be able to do several things at once is more coming from feeling a preferential feeling inside and having interest. The moment you have aversion inside, there's only singular sort of processing. Internal versus external. How aware are you of an internal orientation, an internal locus of control versus external orientation and external locus of control? These are all how you use the vestibular system. Are you more present tense orientated? Is things more timeless now versus past, present, future? Is the timeless now is more I aware, time distinction. Spatial cues, how integrated you are, how much your center of gravity is inside your base of support is more how associated you are. This is all sort of about language. It's so amazing, you know. We're going to take a small break. There's a few questions that we have to orientate us as we wrap the show up with some little tidy tidbits about the origins of language. This is Dr. David Jubb. This is the universe inside our mind. Stay tuned for some more exciting information coming up. That's so amazing, you know, we had a small break here. Of course, you didn't get that break, but during that little like blip, we just discussed a few things about what we've already been talking about. Question came up about the origins of language and older language versus newer language. Sanskrit is the oldest language still being spoken that's written, but Sanskrit is a very modern language. It's got more rounder, softer consonants. The guttural, more harder sounds to make have been lost in the newer languages, but the older languages like German, for instance, or Chinese and some other languages in Africa and places are very, very old. They still have more harder sounds than the newer languages. English is a very new language, very new. It's so amazing how fast this time goes. We've reached the end of our program. I wanted to talk a little bit about feeling first, hearing and seeing, energy and motion, whole brain functioning. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this show. This is all about the origins of language.